"This is your only chance," whispered the letter as Eliza Hawthorne held it trembling in her hands, the edges fraying under her grip while snow pounded against the windows of her modest home, chilling the room and her thoughts as she glanced once more at the sums owed, impossibly high and looming over her family like a dark storm cloud, and she knew she could not survive the month without action. So she wrapped her worn cloak tighter around her shoulders and stepped into the biting wind, each step across the frozen dirt path sending icy shards through her thin boots, the world around her white and silent except for the howling gusts that tore at the edges of her scarf and threatened to pull her hair across her face, obscuring her vision and making her heart pound in rhythm with the wind. Yet she pressed on, knowing the Duke Nathaniel Sterling would not wait for hesitation, that the fate of her family depended on courage she had not known she possessed until this moment. And as the silhouette of Sterling Hall loomed in the distance, dark and foreboding with smoke curling from its chimneys and windows glowing faintly like amber eyes in the storm, she felt both dread and an unnameable pull toward the man who held the power to alter everything. And when she reached the massive oaken doors, her hands numb and lips cracked from the cold, she lifted the iron knocker and let it fall, the sound echoing down the empty stone pathway like a bell of fate. Moments later a servant appeared, eyes widened with surprise at the sight of her soaked and shivering form, and before she could speak, a tall figure emerged from the shadows, Duke Nathaniel Sterling himself, the snowflakes clinging to his dark coat and raven hair, his steel-gray eyes fixed on her with a measured intensity that made her breath catch. "You shouldn't be out here alone," he said, voice calm, commanding, yet edged with something that hinted at understanding she was unprepared for, and in that instant, she felt the weight of every expectation, every fear, and every silent plea she had carried, pressing against her chest as if the storm itself had delivered her to him. And despite the cold, despite the uncertainty, despite the knowledge that this encounter would mark the first step into a world where her pain would be seen and her courage tested, she found herself holding his gaze, recognizing in the depths of those steely eyes a promise that this cold transaction she had feared might be the very bridge that led to something entirely unexpected, a connection neither could yet name. And as the wind whipped around the stone pillars of the hall, she stepped forward, just enough to meet him halfway, letting the snow and fate entwine their paths, the doors closing behind her with a finality that sounded like both warning and welcome. And in that closing, the first chapter of their entwined story began to take shape. Eliza followed the Duke into the grand entrance hall, each step echoing against the cold marble floor and the towering stone walls that rose like silent sentinels around them. The air inside thick with the faint scent of burning wood and wax from the countless candles lining the corridors, their flames casting flickering shadows that danced across the intricate tapestries and portraits of ancestors whose eyes seemed to watch every move. And she could not help but feel the weight of history pressing down upon her, the chill from the storm outside still clinging to her damp cloak as she drew it tighter around her shoulders. Yet there was an unspoken warmth in the air that made her chest ache with anticipation and fear. Nathaniel led her past the great staircase where the cold light of the evening sun filtered through the stained glass, painting fragments of ruby and sapphire across the floor, and he spoke only once, his voice measured and steady. "Your room is ready. Rest before we discuss the arrangements," leaving her to marvel at the discipline in his tone, a mixture of command and unexpected gentleness, as she nodded and allowed herself to be guided through the labyrinthine halls, each turn revealing another corridor filled with relics of a life both lavish and solitary, the quiet punctuated only by the soft scrape of her boots against the stone and the occasional creak of the floorboards, until they reached a small chamber overlooking the gardens, the walls lined with heavy drapes that blocked the last of the fading daylight and softened the edges of the room. Nathaniel motioned for her to enter, and she hesitated for a moment, glancing at him with a mix of caution and curiosity. The way the light caught the angles of his face, highlighting the sharpness of his jaw and the intensity of his gray eyes. "Do not worry. You will be safe here," he said, and she sensed the sincerity beneath the words, the unspoken promise that he had seen more than just her need, that he had glimpsed the depth of her struggle. And as she moved toward the bed, the fine linens whispering under her touch, She felt a tremor of relief mixed with the residual fear from the storm, Nathaniel standing just beyond the door, hands clasped behind his back, watching her settle in with a careful attentiveness that was both intimidating and strangely comforting, the silence between them heavy with unspoken thoughts, each aware of the delicate balance between necessity and choice. As she set down her bag and drew a deep breath, the warmth from the fireplace creeping slowly into the corners of the room, and for the first time since leaving her home, she allowed herself a moment to close her eyes, imagining the safety of these walls as a temporary sanctuary, yet knowing that this was only the beginning of an intricate negotiation of hearts and wills, the storm outside now a distant roar, the space between them charged with possibility, and the quiet understanding that each glance and gesture would carry weight beyond the immediate. As she finally sat on the edge of the bed, the sheets cool beneath her fingers, and Nathaniel, from across the room, allowed a small nod that acknowledged both her courage and the tenuous trust that had begun to form, the kind that could turn a simple agreement into something far more profound, leaving her to wonder what might unfold when the night gave way to morning and the truth of their connection began to reveal itself. The next morning, the first light of dawn filtered through the heavy drapes, painting muted gold stripes across the room, and Eliza Hawthorne stirred awake, the crisp sheets brushing against her chilled skin as she slowly lifted her head, her gaze falling on the faint glow of the fireplace that had been left burning through the night, casting long shadows that stretched across the ornate rug and the carved wooden furniture, and for a moment she simply breathed, savoring the rare quiet. The distant sound of the wind now softened to a whisper against the stone walls, yet the presence of Duke Nathaniel Sterling lingered like a steady pulse in the room, and she could not ignore the way the memory of his eyes, sharp yet understanding, had imprinted itself on her thoughts, compelling her to move with caution yet curiosity. She rose, wrapping the damp edges of her cloak around herself, and walked toward the tall windows that overlooked the snow-covered gardens where the frost glittered like 1,000 tiny stars under the awakening sun. And as she gazed at the frozen branches and the pale light glinting on the stone pathways, the distant echo of footsteps reached her ears, measured and deliberate, and Nathaniel appeared, his coat dusted with remnants of the storm, his expression composed yet betraying the faintest flicker of concern as he observed her from across the room. "Breakfast will be ready shortly," he said, his voice low, carrying the weight of authority yet softened by the unspoken acknowledgment of the night they had shared in silence and observation, and Eliza nodded, feeling a mixture of apprehension and an unarticulated sense of trust forming between them. She returned to the bed to collect her belongings, each movement precise, the sound of her fingers brushing against the smooth linens echoing softly in the chamber. Nathaniel stepped closer, maintaining the delicate distance that spoke volumes without words, his eyes never leaving hers, noting the subtle tremor of her hands and the quiet determination in her posture. They walked together to the dining area, the hall filled with the faint warmth of the hearth, the walls adorned with portraits whose eyes seemed to follow their measured steps. Each glance exchanged weighted with understanding and caution as they settled across from each other at the polished oak table, the steam rising from the breakfast trays mingling with the cool morning air, creating a haze that softened the sharp edges of the room. And as Eliza reached for her cup, Nathaniel finally broke the silence, not with commands but with a statement that carried observation and concern. "You endured the storm well." And in those words was a recognition that went beyond mere survival, acknowledging her courage and the quiet strength she had carried through the night. Eliza met his gaze, the trace of a smile fleeting across her lips, and though they spoke little beyond the formalities of the morning meal, each glance and gesture laid the foundation for an unspoken dialogue, one built on mutual understanding and the delicate balance of power and vulnerability. As the first day of their negotiation, both of hearts and circumstance, began to unfold, leaving the air charged with possibility, and every shadow in the hall seemed to hold the promise of revelation and subtle connection that would shape the days to come. The afternoon sun slanted through the tall windows of Sterling Hall, casting long, golden streaks across the polished floors and illuminating the dust motes that danced lazily in the quiet air. And Eliza Hawthorne moved carefully along the corridor, her steps light, but measured, every sound echoing softly against the stone walls as she carried a small bundle of documents that detailed the remaining debts of her family, her fingers brushing the edges of the fine parchment as if seeking reassurance from the material itself, while Duke Nathaniel Sterling followed a few paces behind, his gaze unwavering, noting the slight tension in her shoulders and the determined set of her jaw. And though he said nothing, the subtle narrowing of his eyes suggested he was weighing her resilience, observing how she carried the weight of her responsibilities with a mix of grace and quiet anxiety. The warmth from the hearths lining the hallway blending with the soft light of the day to create a gentle contrast to the chill she had endured outside. And as they entered the study, the heavy oak doors closing behind them with a resonant thud, Eliza carefully laid the bundle on the broad desk, straightening her posture as Nathaniel moved to the window, his stance tall and commanding, yet softened by the thoughtful tilt of his head as he regarded her. "You have prepared everything meticulously," he finally said, voice steady but not unyielding, and she lifted her eyes, meeting his, feeling the weight of acknowledgment that carried with it both expectation and an unspoken approval. She nodded quietly, her heartbeat steadying under his calm scrutiny, and as she began to organize the documents across the desk, sliding each piece with precision and attention, Nathaniel stepped closer, the faint sound of his boots against the floor drawing her gaze, and for a brief moment, their hands almost brushed as he adjusted a loose parchment, the subtle contact sending a ripple of awareness through her, the kind that made every shared silence thick with meaning. And they worked side by side, moving with a careful rhythm that blended necessity and tentative connection, his eyes occasionally flicking toward her, noting the way she resisted the chill from the stone walls, the slight quiver in her hands, the determination in her posture. And in those glances, she felt both the scrutiny and the silent respect that he offered sparingly to few. As the hours passed and the light shifted, drawing shadows across the stacks of papers and the corners of the room, the day waning yet their focus unbroken, a quiet understanding developing between them, a recognition of shared purpose and unspoken resilience. And when Nathaniel finally spoke again, it was with measured care. "Your attention to detail will see your family through this." The words carrying more than simple acknowledgement, hinting at the rare glimpse of trust he extended. And Eliza felt the weight of that trust settle over her shoulders, a mantle, both daunting and strangely comforting, knowing that in this room, in the quiet diligence of their efforts, a subtle bond was forming, one that promised guidance and guarded compassion, leaving the future uncertain, but the first steps of alliance between them unmistakably taken. As the late afternoon sun dipped behind the frozen treetops, casting long shadows across the snow-laden grounds of Sterling Hall, Eliza Hawthorne carefully folded the last of the documents and stacked them neatly upon the wide, polished desk, her fingers lingering over the edges of the parchment as if the careful arrangement itself could bring certainty to her anxious thoughts. While Duke Nathaniel Sterling watched from the window, his tall frame silhouetted against the fading light, the sharp angles of his face softened only slightly by the warmth of the hearth behind him. And when he finally turned toward her, his gaze was steady, measuring, not with judgment, but with the quiet recognition of her determination and resilience. "You have managed more in these hours than many would in a lifetime," he said, his voice low but carrying a weight that seemed to settle over the room like the faint scent of the burning wood. And Eliza felt a small flicker of relief at his acknowledgement. Though she maintained her composure, her posture erect, her mind focused on the details yet conscious of the subtle charge in the air between them. And as she prepared to speak, he gestured toward the chair across from her, the motion deliberate, offering not command but invitation, and she seated herself, the soft rustle of her gown against the smooth leather audible in the stillness, as Nathaniel joined her with a measured pace, each step echoing slightly in the high-ceilinged chamber, the warmth of the room contrasting with the lingering chill on her skin from the storm outside. And they sat in an almost ritualized silence for a few moments, the only sound the soft crackle of the fireplace and the distant groan of the settling hall, before Nathaniel leaned slightly forward, resting his hands lightly on the desk, his gray eyes locking with hers. And in that gaze was a quiet intensity that conveyed understanding, expectation, and the unspoken promise that he had noticed the care and courage she had displayed. And as Eliza met his eyes, she sensed the unspoken dialogue that passed between them, the subtle acknowledgment that this was more than a mere transaction, that the resilience she had shown and the dignity with which she carried herself mattered. And in the soft light that played across the room, she felt a tentative sense of alignment, a fragile bridge forming between their intentions. And though no words were exchanged beyond the formal acknowledgment, the room seemed charged with possibility, each shadow and flicker of candlelight reinforcing the sense that every careful movement, every glance, carried significance. As they began to navigate the delicate balance between duty and understanding, between necessity and the quiet stirring of trust, and as the sun disappeared behind the horizon, leaving only the warm glow of the candles and hearth to illuminate the chamber, Eliza felt the first real measure of connection, subtle yet undeniable, a silent accord forming that would shape the next hours, the next conversations, and the tenuous steps toward an unforeseen understanding between two people brought together by circumstance and held in that moment by mutual awareness and unspoken respect. As evening fell over Sterling Hall, the golden light of the setting sun fading into deep amber and casting long shadows across the high stone walls, Eliza Hawthorne stood at the tall windows of the study, gazing out at the snow-dusted gardens that stretched beneath the darkening sky, the wind whispering through the bare branches like a distant sigh, and she drew her cloak closer around her shoulders, feeling the weight of the day, the decisions made, and the delicate understanding forming between herself and Duke Nathaniel Sterling, who remained a few steps behind, silent yet observant, his presence filling the room with a quiet authority that was tempered only by the subtle awareness he had of her thoughts and feelings. And as she turned to face him, she noted the soft line of concern that crossed his sharp features, the gentle narrowing of his steel-gray eyes as he regarded her. "You handled the arrangements with admirable care," he said, his voice calm but not unyielding, carrying a note of recognition that made her chest tighten, and she nodded, her lips pressing together in a small, controlled smile, acknowledging the praise while maintaining the composure she had cultivated through necessity. And for a long moment, they shared a quiet understanding, the kind that passed between two people who were beginning to see beyond circumstance to the person within. And Nathaniel stepped closer, his movements deliberate, the soft rustle of his coat barely audible in the stillness of the chamber, and Eliza could feel the subtle shift in the air, the faint charge of connection that had begun to grow since she had arrived, the shared experience of the storm and the delicate negotiations of trust creating a tension that was both exhilarating and uncertain. And as he reached for the chair opposite her, she realized that every glance, every measured movement, carried weight, that the simple act of being seen and acknowledged by him was a step towards something far larger than the papers and the debts that had brought her here. And when she seated herself, the flickering candlelight illuminating her features, she noticed the way his gaze softened, how the corner of his mouth hinted at a faint approval, and in that small gesture, she felt the first true sense of being understood, not just for her diligence, but for the courage she had shown in facing the storm and the unknown. And as they settled into a careful rhythm, discussing next steps and reviewing the arrangements, the conversation flowed with a surprising ease, each word measured but not rigid, every gesture and glance laden with unspoken acknowledgment. And in the quiet of the study, surrounded by the fading warmth of the day and the soft glow of the fireplace, a subtle bond continued to form, a connection built not on grand declarations but on observation, understanding, and the unspoken promise that in this place, amidst the stillness and the remnants of a storm, something profound and lasting was beginning to take root between them. The fire in the grand hearth flickered and danced across the walls of Sterling Hall, casting elongated shadows that seemed to move with the room. And Eliza Hawthorne sat at the edge of the polished oak desk, her hands resting lightly on the papers she had arranged, the soft rustle of the parchment punctuating the quiet. As Duke Nathaniel Sterling moved toward the tall window, his figure outlined against the twilight sky that seeped through the glass, the faint glow of the sunset painting his sharp features with a hint of warmth that softened the sternness of his usual expression. And for a long moment, neither spoke, the silence rich with unspoken thought, and the careful measurement of emotion. Before Nathaniel stepped closer, his boots making a muted sound against the stone floor, and Eliza felt the air shift subtly. The tension of proximity mingling with the cautious understanding that had been building between them since the storm. He leaned slightly against the edge of the desk, keeping his hands visible, a silent acknowledgment that their interaction was both delicate and deliberate. "You have done more than I expected," he said finally, the words carrying a quiet weight that resonated through the room, and she met his gaze, noting the faint flicker of something almost like approval in his gray eyes, her pulse quickening slightly as she realized that his recognition was not merely of her diligence, but of the courage and persistence she had shown in navigating the uncertainties of the day. And as they moved through the next tasks together, organizing the documents and reviewing the plans for the coming week, their motions became synchronized in a way that spoke of a growing rhythm, each gesture and glance reinforcing the subtle bond that was forming, the firelight catching in Eliza's hair and reflecting in Nathaniel's eyes, making each small movement charged with significance without a word being spoken. And when she paused to adjust a paper, he reached forward to steady it, their hands nearly brushing, the contact fleeting but enough to heighten the awareness of the space between them. And in that shared moment, both recognized the fragile connection that had emerged, built not on overt declaration but on observation, shared attention, and a quiet appreciation for the perseverance displayed, the evening shadows lengthening as the sun finally disappeared behind the horizon, leaving the room illuminated only by the warm glow of the fire and the soft candlelight, the air heavy with the possibility of trust and the careful, unspoken negotiation of understanding between two people who had been brought together by circumstance, yet whose interactions were beginning to shape a subtle, profound intimacy, one that would guide their actions, their choices, and the unfolding of the days to come. The hall outside silent save for the faint whisper of the wind through the ancient stone, while within, every glance, every slight gesture, every pause in speech became a part of a delicate choreography that neither could yet name, but both felt with unmistakable clarity as the night deepened and the shadows of the room intertwined with the growing awareness of one another, leaving the air charged with the anticipation of revelation, understanding, and the continuing formation of a bond that promised to shape the remainder of their time together. The evening had deepened into a rich indigo sky outside Sterling Hall, the last light of day slipping beneath the horizon and leaving only the soft, flickering glow of candlelight to illuminate the high ceilings and the intricate patterns carved into the wooden beams. And Eliza Hawthorne moved carefully across the polished floor of the study, carrying a small tray with fresh tea and a plate of warm bread, the aroma filling the quiet space and mingling with the faint scent of burning wood from the hearth, while Duke Nathaniel Sterling observed her from the corner of the room, the sharp lines of his face softened by the gentle shadows cast by the firelight, and for a moment, their eyes met, an unspoken acknowledgment passing between them that carried weight far beyond the simple act of bringing refreshments. She placed the tray upon the desk with precise movements, the soft clink of china punctuating the stillness, and he stepped closer, his presence commanding yet restrained, allowing the space between them to remain charged with subtle tension. "You are careful with everything," he remarked quietly, the tone measured, carrying a note of admiration beneath its calm exterior, and she inclined her head slightly, feeling the warmth of his attention even as she maintained her composure, the soft flicker of the candles highlighting the determined set of her features, and as she poured the tea, their movements almost synchronized, a rhythm forming between them that spoke of mutual observation and quiet understanding. And when he reached for a cup, their fingers brushed ever so slightly, the contact brief yet enough to heighten the awareness of each other, the room seeming to hold its breath around the moment, and she realized how attuned they had become to each other's presence, the subtle gestures and glances carrying meaning without words, Nathaniel's gray eyes lingering on her with a careful intensity, noting the way her fingers trembled slightly with the weight of responsibility. And in that gaze was the recognition of not only her diligence but the courage she had displayed in facing the storm and the unfamiliar halls of his ancestral home. And as they settled into a quiet rhythm of conversation, discussing the next steps to resolve the matters that had brought her here, The conversation flowed with a surprising ease, each word measured but infused with a growing awareness of the other, and the warmth of the fire and the soft glow of the candles seemed to wrap around them, creating a sanctuary within the stone walls, a space where trust could begin to take root. And as the night deepened, the snow outside reflecting the faint light of the moon, the two moved with deliberate attentiveness, every glance, every gesture, every brief pause building the unspoken connection, the subtle acknowledgment of shared purpose and mutual respect laying the foundation for understanding and an intimacy that would guide their steps in the days to come. The shadows and the flickering light framing them in a quiet tableau of anticipation and possibility, each aware that the fragile trust between them was the beginning of something far greater than either could yet name, yet unmistakably felt in the gentle cadence of their actions and the charged stillness of the room. The night had settled over Sterling Hall, the moon casting a soft silver glow through the tall windows, and Eliza Hawthorne stood near the hearth, her hands wrapped around a warm cup of tea, the steam rising in delicate spirals into the quiet air, while Duke Nathaniel Sterling moved with deliberate calm to the large window that framed the snow-covered gardens, his silhouette sharp against the pale light outside. And for a long moment, neither spoke, the room filled only with the soft crackle of the dying fire and the occasional whisper of wind against the stone walls. Yet in the silence, a subtle connection had grown, a shared awareness that stretched across the space between them. And when Nathaniel finally turned toward her, his expression measured but softer than before. He gestured to the desk where the organized documents lay. "Everything is in order, thanks to your diligence," he said, the words carrying a weight of respect and acknowledgment that made her chest lift slightly, and she inclined her head, feeling a quiet satisfaction mingle with the warmth of the room, as though the glow of the fire and the silver light of the moon were both affirming her efforts. And as they moved toward the desk together to review the final details, their steps slow, deliberate, and mindful of each other's presence, the air seemed charged with unspoken understanding, each glance and subtle movement speaking volumes. Nathaniel's hand resting lightly on the edge of the desk as he watched her arrange the papers with careful precision, and Eliza, aware of his attention, worked with a steady focus, noting the subtle changes in his posture and expression, the soft narrowing of his eyes, the hint of a smile that had appeared in fleeting moments throughout the day. And in that quiet exchange, a delicate rhythm formed, the interplay of responsibility and awareness blending into a mutual recognition that their actions and intentions were intertwined, the shadows of the room shifting with the flicker of candlelight, emphasizing the contours of their faces and the subtle nuances of their expressions. And as the night deepened, the room seemed to hold its breath around them, the quiet punctuated only by the soft rustle of papers and the slow, steady tick of the grandfather clock in the corner. And in that measured silence, both sensed the fragile bond that had taken root between them, an understanding born of shared effort, vigilance, and careful attention, the connection growing stronger with every thoughtful glance and deliberate movement. And when Eliza finally set the last document in place and turned to meet his gaze, she saw in Nathaniel's eyes a reflection of her own awareness, a quiet acknowledgment of the trust and respect that had been cultivated. And as they lingered in the soft glow of the fire and moonlight, the possibility of what might come next hung in the air, a promise unspoken yet palpable, the night around them a silent witness to the beginnings of something both fragile and profound, a connection that would shape the days to follow and guide the unfolding of their shared path in ways neither could yet predict but both could sense, leaving the room suspended in anticipation, quiet understanding, and the tender gravity of unspoken trust. The first light of dawn crept slowly across Sterling Hall, casting a pale, silvery glow through the tall, arched windows and illuminating the frost that clung delicately to the edges of the stone ledges. And Eliza Hawthorne stood near the window, her hands wrapped around a cup of warm tea, the heat seeping into her fingers and offering a small comfort against the lingering chill from the night, while Duke Nathaniel Sterling moved quietly to the desk, his tall frame steady and commanding, yet softened by the reflective light that touched his features. And as he glanced toward her, his gray eyes held a thoughtful intensity that made her heart tighten in quiet anticipation. "The arrangements are satisfactory," he said in a low, measured voice, each word deliberate, carrying a subtle weight that acknowledged not only her efforts but the perseverance she had displayed. And Eliza met his gaze with a composed nod, sensing the depth of understanding in his observation, the silence between them filling with unspoken acknowledgment, their shared awareness a gentle tether as the hall seemed to exhale the calm of early morning. She placed the cup carefully on the windowsill and turned toward the papers that awaited review, moving with deliberate precision while Nathaniel approached, the sound of his boots muffled against the polished floor, and for a moment, their proximity alone created a subtle tension, a delicate awareness of one another that neither ignored, each gesture and glance measured and meaningful. He stood beside her, his presence steady, lending a quiet reassurance as they moved together through the documents, reviewing the arrangements with careful attention, the soft rustle of parchment punctuating the stillness of the room. And as they worked, the sunlight shifted, highlighting the contours of their faces and casting long shadows across the floor. The subtle interplay of light and dark reflecting the growing complexity of their interaction. Nathaniel paused, resting a hand lightly on the desk near her own, and though no touch passed, the nearness conveyed a silent recognition of effort, patience, and courage, and Eliza felt the weight of his observation, the acknowledgement of more than mere duty, sensing the trust forming in the careful attention he gave to her work. As the minutes stretched into a gentle rhythm, the quiet of the study enveloping them, the distant call of a bird outside the frost-laden gardens a soft reminder of the world beyond the stone walls. And in that shared space, the subtle bond that had been building over days of careful observation and deliberate interaction strengthened, each exchange, glance, and pause layering understanding upon understanding, the room alive with unspoken communication. And as they reached the final documents and laid them in order, both paused, their eyes meeting with the quiet acknowledgement that the task completed together was more than a duty fulfilled. It was a moment of connection, a recognition of courage, patience, and trust that had taken root in the silence of early morning, leaving them poised on the edge of a new day. The possibilities of what might come stretching before them like the frost-covered gardens bathed in soft light outside, fragile, tentative, yet undeniable. The morning light filtered gently through the tall windows of Sterling Hall, illuminating the frost patterns on the glass and casting soft, shimmering reflections across the polished wooden floors. And Eliza Hawthorne sat at the wide oak desk, carefully unfolding a letter she had received the previous evening, the edges worn and the ink slightly faded, while Duke Nathaniel Sterling approached from the doorway, his steps measured and deliberate, the gray of his eyes softened by the delicate glow of the rising sun. And he paused just behind her chair, observing silently as she read, sensing the subtle tension in her posture and the careful restraint in her expression. "There is more to this than I initially understood," he said quietly, his voice steady yet carrying a note of curiosity. And Eliza lifted her gaze to meet his, the flickering candlelight reflecting in her eyes. And for a brief moment, neither spoke. The room filled with the quiet hum of anticipation, the distant chime of the clock marking the slow passage of time. She set the letter down carefully, her fingers lingering on the paper as though drawing courage from its weight. And he stepped closer, resting a hand lightly on the back of her chair, the proximity both grounding and charged with unspoken awareness. "I can see the depth of what you have carried alone," he continued, his tone carrying a rare gentleness that contrasted with the usual precision and control of his manner. And Eliza felt a subtle warmth rising within her, a quiet acknowledgement of the understanding that had begun to bridge the distance between them. And as they turned together toward the large window overlooking the gardens, the frost sparkling like countless tiny stars in the early morning light, the air seemed to hold a fragile stillness, every sound amplified. The soft creak of the floorboards, the distant rustle of the wind through the barren branches, the quiet thrum of their shared awareness. Nathaniel's gaze lingering on her with a careful intensity, noting the slight relaxation in her shoulders, the gentle exhale that spoke of a momentary relief. And in the unspoken language of observation, he recognized both her courage and the careful restraint she maintained despite the weight of her responsibilities. As they moved together to review the plans for the coming week, each gesture measured, each glance deliberate, creating a rhythm of silent communication, the warmth of the sun mingling with the residual heat of the fireplace, bathing the room in a comforting glow, and with every passing moment, the connection between them deepened, not through words alone, but through the careful attention to one another's presence, the quiet acknowledgement that the trust and understanding they had nurtured over days of careful observation and shared effort were becoming more tangible. And as they paused to consider the next steps, Nathaniel's hand hovered near hers, a subtle signal of encouragement and shared purpose. The delicate interplay of proximity and awareness reinforcing the unspoken bond forming. Between them, the room suspended in a quiet, anticipatory calm, as though the house itself had paused to witness the tentative trust, mutual respect, and the first hints of something profoundly enduring taking root between two people who had found in each other not only a partner for duty but a witness to their courage, resilience, and quiet humanity, leaving the morning filled with promise and the unspoken potential of all that might follow. By mid-morning, the hallways of Sterling Hall were filled with a soft, diffused light, the frost from the early hours beginning to melt into delicate beads of water along the edges of the windows, and Eliza Hawthorne moved quietly through the corridors, her hands clasped together as she approached the library, the polished floors reflecting the warm glow from the fireplace that had been lit to chase away the lingering chill, while Duke Nathaniel Sterling followed closely, his posture steady, the weight of his presence both commanding and subtly reassuring. And as they entered the library, the tall shelves stacked with leather-bound volumes seemed to hold a silence that encouraged focus and contemplation. He gestured toward a chair by the large desk, and she seated herself, setting down the small bundle of papers she had carried, and he began reviewing the documents with careful attention, his gray eyes scanning each line with meticulous precision, occasionally lifting to meet her gaze, noting the subtle tremor in her fingers or the way she drew a slow breath to steady herself. "I understand more now than I did before," he said, his voice carrying quiet gravity and measured warmth, the words settling between them, acknowledging both her courage and the burden she had carried. And as they discussed the steps needed to ensure the arrangements were secure, their motions became synchronized, the soft rustle of parchment blending with the faint creak of the floorboards, each glance and movement deliberate, the room heavy with an unspoken understanding and the quiet intensity of shared purpose. And when Eliza paused to adjust a stack of papers, Nathaniel's hand hovered nearby, the nearness a subtle acknowledgement of his attention without intrusion, the space between them charged with careful awareness and trust. And as they turned together toward the large windows that overlooked the snow-dappled gardens, the light shifting with the day, casting long shadows across the floors and bookshelves, he observed the way her gaze lingered on the horizon, seeing both the responsibility she bore and the quiet strength she displayed. And in that recognition, Eliza felt the warmth of acknowledgment settle across her shoulders, a silent affirmation of the resilience and integrity she had maintained. As the morning deepened, they continued their work side by side, the rhythm of their movements and the careful interchange of glances establishing a subtle connection, a shared understanding that required no words yet conveyed the depth of observation and trust. And the sun climbed higher, illuminating the room and highlighting the delicate interplay of light and shadow across the desk and the spines of the books, reinforcing the growing sense of collaboration and quiet intimacy, each aware that the bond they were forming, nurtured through attention, effort, and mutual respect, was becoming tangible. And in that bright, clear morning, the beginnings of an unspoken promise hung in the air, delicate and fragile, yet unmistakably present, shaping the path ahead and the continuing journey of trust, understanding, and the careful unfolding of connection between them. As the sun dipped low over Sterling Hall, casting the long shadows of the stone pillars across the frost-dusted gardens, Eliza Hawthorne stood at the edge of the library, her fingers brushing against the spines of the leather-bound volumes, feeling the weight of the day and the subtle shift in the air between herself and Duke Nathaniel Sterling, who remained a few paces behind, his presence steady and unwavering, the gray of his eyes softened by the amber glow of the fading sunlight. And for a moment, the world outside seemed to pause, the distant call of a bird, the whisper of wind through the bare branches, all fading into silence, leaving only the quiet rhythm of their shared attention. He stepped closer, his boots making a muted sound against the polished floor, and Eliza could feel the subtle charge of proximity, the awareness of his gaze, and the careful attention he paid to her every movement. "Your work today has been beyond what I anticipated," he said quietly, each word deliberate, carrying not only acknowledgment but respect, and she met his eyes, sensing the rare sincerity in the statement, a gentle warmth rising despite the chill that lingered from the morning. As they moved together to the tall windows overlooking the gardens, the light catching in the frost and creating tiny diamonds that sparkled in the soft amber. Nathaniel's presence beside her offering a quiet reassurance as they both absorbed the calm of the fading day, and as she turned to glance at him, she noticed the faint curve of his mouth, the almost imperceptible softening of his eyes, and she felt a subtle recognition of the trust that had been cultivated over hours of careful observation, deliberate actions, and shared responsibility. The air between them charged not with urgency, but with the quiet gravity of mutual understanding. He gestured toward the study table, the papers and documents of the day neatly arranged. "These are all in order thanks to your careful diligence," he said, his voice steady, calm, carrying a note of approval that settled over the room like a warm mantle, and Eliza inclined her head, a soft acknowledgment of both the words and the intent behind them. Sensing that this moment marked the culmination of careful work, trust, and the subtle formation of a bond that had taken root in the shared attention and awareness of each other's efforts. And as the last light of the sun faded and the shadows deepened, they stood side by side, the quiet of Sterling Hall surrounding them, every detail, the flicker of candlelight, the warmth of the hearth, the subtle shifting of shadows, adding to the sense of unspoken understanding. And in that stillness, the beginnings of a profound connection became tangible, a delicate promise of the days to come, of shared responsibility, recognition, and quiet care. And as they lingered together in the gentle glow of the fading evening, the room seemed to hold its breath around them, leaving a suspended sense of possibility and anticipation, the unspoken acknowledgement that the careful trust, attention, and shared experience had created a bond neither could fully name yet, but one that would continue to shape every step, glance, and choice in the unfolding path that lay ahead for both.